Whoop, whoop. All right, folks, this is the almost penultimate little bit of programming for our Voodoonauts Summer Workshop 2021. Thank you, fellows, for being here. Um, uh, I think the beginning of this got cut off.
It's just one word, I think, just prior.
I figured it out. All right, so y'all, this is Agent of Change featuring our dear friend Kayla Lightner. Prior to joining Aisha Pandey Literary, Kayla worked as an assistant at Liza Dawson Associates. She is a member of the Association of American Literary Agents, as well as a member of the DEI committee. She's also an adult. Hold on, this scrolling and this thing is weird. She is also on the Adult Internship Grant Committee for We Need Diverse Books. A Georgia native, she earned her BA in English from Vassar College. Before finding her way to publishing, she held various positions, including fashion market assistant at Harper's Bazaar and freelance writer at Creative Loafing Atlanta. An adventurous reader, Kayla loves stories across commercial fiction, literary fiction, and nonfiction that masterfully straddle the line between storytelling and teaching her something new. Her full manuscript wish list is here.
And I'll put a link in the chat.
No, you're not working. I got you, sis. When Kayla's not reading, she can be found writing and performing stand-up and reminiscing on her rugby days. Welcome, Kayla. So
thank you for having me.
Oh my goodness. This is our first face-to-face conversation, so this is actually a double cool. So I think what is always necessary is let's hear the origin story of Kayla as I'd love to hear how the Black Speculative came into your life. What was the first time that it hit you?
That's a good question. When the Black Speculative came into my life, and I would say it actually came in later. It came in later in my life when I was in college. And so before we get to that, I'm just talking about my love of speculative and where that stemmed from. And so growing up, I found myself always gravitating towards narratives across multiple mediums. So of course, books, but also film/TV, podcasts before podcasts became like what they are now in the media space, that incorporated elements of the speculative, especially as a tool of social analysis. And so always kind of loved stories that felt a little weird, a little off kilter, and were, amongst other things, analyzing the current society that we lived in. And so, of course, being young, didn't have that vocabulary. They didn't know why I liked what I liked, but looking back now, that's what it was. That's what really spoke to me about speculative. And so grew up watching The Twilight Zone with my mom. That was kind of like a core, our mutual love of at the time I would call it just weird, of the weird, was a core part of our relationship. And so every New Year's Eve, I think either New Year's Eve or Thanksgiving, whenever they would have the Twilight Zone marathon, we would sit and watch it together. And again, like not having the language to articulate when I was younger, but this kind of I felt this need to compartmentalize my love of speculative, because I thought it wasn't something for me. And so in watching The Twilight Zone, which is, 1950s, so very white, very white, and thinking, okay, this is something that white people do, that white people enjoy, that white people create, and I can watch and enjoy too, but it's not necessarily for me. And so in some way made that decision, and just like, and sat with it. I was like, okay, cool, I guess. And it wasn't until either my freshman or sophomore year of college, and so fast forward, 10, 15 years later, where the Black speculative entered my life, and I realized, oh no, there is actually a space for me here. There are writers who are doing this work. And it was just a matter of me finding them. And so I will always attribute a professor I had in college, Eve Dunbar, and her class about Afrofuturism as just being such a pivotal point in my journey as a reader, especially in my relationship with speculative fiction, and realizing that so much of, we'll say specifically, the African American experience, how much of it is reflected or is integrally tied to tropes, we'll say tropes within speculative. And so the idea of being dropped into an environment that is inherently and overtly hostile and making a space for yourself, and how that often is a trope that appears specifically in science fiction, but sometimes in fantasy too. And like how that is and so it was just like this huge light bulb moment where I was like, oh, this whole time I was convinced that this wasn't for me, but like, no, there are core parts of my own experiences as an African American woman that, if anything, has been co-opted by the genre. And so that was also, of course, where I came across writers from that ranged all the way from uber commercial science fiction, or I'll say speculative fiction. So Nala Hopkinson, Brown Girl in the Rain, that's to this day one of my favorite books. But then of course everybody like on the other end, like more literary, and so Toni Morrison's Paradise and how that's a speculative text. And again, to this day, one of my favorite books, and everybody in between. So of course Colson Whitehead, Victor Laval, Octavia Butler, of course. And it was just all of a sudden being dropped into this treasure trove of Black writers. It was just like this singular moment of validation of like, oh, almost like coming home. I'm like, oh yeah, these people were just here waiting for me. And of course, that now that love has trickled over into what I'm looking for as an agent. And then what I continue to read to this day. And so of course now not newer authors, new to me, not necessarily new to the world, but their works, kind of like N.K. Jemisin, just adding just that list of writers that I love is just growing. And now as an agent, I get to kind of, if anything, enact that love and searching for new writers who can join, that wonderful canon.
Love that. What do you think was one of the first, actually, what was the first piece of Black speculative fiction that reflected you, like made you feel really seen? And what was the most recent piece of Black speculative fiction that made you feel really seen?
Ooh, that's a good question. The first piece of Black speculative fiction. Oh, okay. So for that one, it is a short story called The Space Traders by Derek. Oh, I'm blanking on his last name. I want to say Bell. Let's see. Sorry, I'm also looking it up because I want to be able to give the author his props.
Derek Bell.
You got it, Bell. That's it.
Say it again.
Yeah, you're right. It's Bell. Derek Bell.
Derek Bell. Okay, got it. Cool. I want to make sure I wasn't mispronouncing his name. But it is this very short story. I highly recommend it. That essentially I'm gonna butcher the plot. But it essentially is this really short piece that that takes place in an alternative current day where aliens make contact with Earth. And they're like, we will give you all the solutions to your problems, global warming, an unstable economy. Like we will make your world a utopia, essentially. And that's also another fascination of mine, utopias and dystopias, and how they're often the same thing, depending on who you're talking to. But we will essentially make your world a utopia, but in exchange you have to give us all the Black people. They don't say what they're going to do with them, but they just say you have to give us your Black population. And it just looks at the fallout from that. And so at first everyone's like, no, we could never. But then it's like, right. And it was just like, and it was just it was one, infuriating, but also really funny, because like I could see by the end of the story, I was like, yeah, that's what would happen. And so it just looks at again how Black people specific, and of course the story was very centralized in the African American experience, and so I realized that there is that's leaving out a whole multiple groups of people out of the conversation. But just looking at the fallout, it was such I think a really poignant observation on how specifically Black Americans are so intimately tied into the fabric of the US from a commercial perspective, from a cultural perspective, where like when you get rid of all the Black people, what happens? It's all of a sudden music looks different, sports look different. Just there's so many things, so many ways that we are baked into the fabric of this country. And so I think not even like, of course, feeling seen, but also just like feeling again, like validated of like, oh yeah, like how much of our identity as Black Americans is tied to what it means to be an American in general. And again, that leaves out so many different communities from the conversation, but it was a story that was very much tied to the Black American experience. And then I think the most recent piece of Black speculative fiction that I felt seen. Ooh, that's a hard one too. I would say I would say it's going to be N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy. And so not any specific book. I reread that series at least once a year, or reread that trilogy, excuse me, at least once a year. Just one, because it's a masterclass in so many things inside. Like, I feel like I'm not even doing her justice. The fact that she's able to write in the second person and it feels so flawless and so organic to the point where you don't even question it, and how she also uses point of view as a method of storytelling, but is also looking at geopolitics. Like, I could go on and on and on and on about her. But I think the reason I feel seen with her work is just more or I guess I should say I more identify with her origin story, and how, and I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this in your writing journey, of how for so long she was told, oh, this doesn't work. Like, what are you doing? Like, a very much seen as working outside the tradition of science fiction. And so because she's working outside that tradition, which is usually white, which is usually male, just discounted. And now the fact that anytime I talk to editors at Orbit or Harper Voyager or Saga or any of the sci-fi and fantasy imprints at the Big Five, the first thing they say is, we're looking for more, speculative stories that also have a reverence for words like N.K. Jemisin. So how all of a sudden you become the standard bearer after for so long being discounted. It's like, you don't know what you're doing. This is not the right way to do science fiction. And so feelings again seen in that validation of like, oh no, yes, you do belong here. And sometimes it's more just an assertion of you making that assertion yourself, as opposed to waiting for someone to give it to you.
Love that. I also love that trilogy.
So good.
The third book hurt me in ways that I didn't know were possible after the first two. And I was just like, y'all are rude and bangy. Like, you need to get a therapist and leave me the hell alone. So those are two of the books that have affected you. And you are looking for a range of books to represent, right? So what we'd like to hear all the kinds of books that you're interested in. No, I just put your MSWL in. Let's just talk about the speculative books right now.
Sure. And of course, if the conversation kind of organically goes to what my interests are outside of speculative, I'm more than happy to speak to that as well. But yes, I am very much an omnivorous reader. And I attribute that to starting off at an agency, LP, you mentioned at the top of the panel, Eliza Dawson Associates, which was very, very commercial. And when I say commercial, I'm speaking from an industry, using that term in the way that it's used in the industry. So commercial usually means very plot driven, very very action heavy. And I'll speak to this in a second too, on the opposite end of that spectrum is literary. And so a lot of times you'll hear literary versus commercial. And I do think, and that can be its own panel, when I first started off working as an agent assistant, I absolutely thought that literary meant flowery prose, very, very much tied to character development as opposed to plot development. And then commercial was very plot development heavy. And so that must have meant that literary was high art and commercial was low art. And now, of course, you're learning and growing and changing all the time. Now I'm like, no, that's not the case. There are commercial novels that equally have beautiful prose N.K. Jemisin is a perfect example of that. And so more specifically, the delineation isn't about quality of language, it's just what's driving the story. And so commercial plot driven, X, Y, Z happens. Literary is more, again, internally focused, the internal toils and whatnot of the characters themselves. And then they're in the middle, there's upmarket, and that's kind of if like literary and commercial had a baby. And so it's very plot driven, but and also it's very much tied, but also a core part of it is like the character's development as well.
Right.
And so those want to establish a kind of a standard vocabulary for a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about in a second about taste. And so with speculative, my interest spans that gamut from commercial to literary. I'm equally interested in spaceships and dragons as I am with more literary novels that maybe have like speculative elements, so like magical realism or like elements of like psychological horror, and really everything in between. So I really am that omnivorousness, I don't know if that's a word, really applies to speculative. And so on the more commercial side, I really am drawn to, like I said earlier, anything that dissects utopias versus dystopias, and how those two things can be one and the same depending on who you ask. And also is kind of subverting that dystopia / utopia tradition established by greats like Aldous Huxley and George Orwell, and which of course, like, I love 1984, I love Brave New World, but what I'm looking for are newer narratives that bring something new to those traditions, and then subverts them in a lot of ways, because again, while they're great and I love them, they are stemming from the imagination of white men. And so of course that brings its own level of privilege and power to it. And so I'm always excited to see what happens to our understandings of utopias and dystopias when we bring other voices to the conversation. Also on the commercial side, I love pantheons. I love Greek pantheons. I do, and Roman pantheons. I love the Roman god, Greek and Roman gods. I could read about them all day, but I love narratives that can introduce me to pantheons from other cultures. Just from that line in my bio about narratives that storytell, but also teach me something new. And so teaching me something new about a pantheon I had no knowledge about previously. So this is not a Black author. But I still sing her praises just because I think she is phenomenal. R.F. Kuang, who wrote the Convo trilogy, and that in itself, that isn't a pantheon of her own creation, but I love that equally, of like people who can come up with Greek, or not, with gods and myths and whatnot of their own imagination. I think that's one of the coolest things ever. The fact that you can create this whole world with its own religious / social history. That's one of my favorite things about getting to work with speculative authors in general. And so anything that introduces me to a new pantheon, either that currently exists with a non-white culture, or something of the author's own creation, and that's specifically with science fiction and fantasy. And then we move over to like more magical realism and horror, which falls again more on that literary side of my taste. Anything that uses either magical realism or horror as, again, a tool of social analysis. And so I think on most notably like Black Mirror-esque, which I think is just kind of like the newer version of Twilight Zone in some ways. I think a little bit more bold than Twilight Zone. And so any book that uses the speculative as a tool of social analysis, also anything that uses horror as a means to poke at those social structures. And so I will say I am not a vampire werewolf. I absolutely had a Twilight phase. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Middle school me was living my best life in the early 2000s. What a time to be alive. But I will say that has not followed me into adulthood. So I don't usually do like urban fantasy, or anything with like werewolves or vampires walking around in the real world. That is not a hard no. Again, if the
have you seen them with Black people?
Say that again.
Have you seen them with Black people?
No, I had nothing else to say. So again, if you can subvert that a little bit, I am open to it. So it's not a hard pass. I can be convinced if it's something truly like refreshing and new. I will happily read it. In terms of horror, I'm thinking kind of like Colson Whitehead's Nickel Boys, and so just looking, especially with history and and that's kind of delving into other tastes that I have. But I think in another life, I would have been a historian, just because I feel like the things that get forgotten just for lack of documentation within specific communities, within a nation's history. There's truly just some, excuse my language, but like horrific shit that we just don't know about, or that gets forgotten. And so I'm always excited when a narrative can use history as a means to examine the horrific. All that to say, and this is always touchy. I was, and actually with this crew, I don't think I would need to kind of say it with as much care as I usually need to. Slavery narratives that are horrific just for horror's sake, so that has a lot of trauma porn in them, I'm not the right fit for, but I don't think that needs fleshing out with this crew. And then finally with magical realism, anything that takes place in kind of like isolated Southern towns. So Gloria Naylor's Mama Day I skipped over that. That was one of those texts that I found early on that, again, I was like, like that, in that case, I was like, oh, I'm seeing my grandmother here. I'm seeing my great aunts here. And so anything that is really integrating elements of magical realism while also talking about Black womanhood, I will read it. I'll probably read that any day of the week. And so, yeah, I know that's like a really robust and lengthy spiel about what I'm looking for, but as you can see, it really is so wide ranging.
All over the place in the best way.
Yeah.
So have you noticed that there are any struggles for, have you experienced any struggles as a Black agent in the publishing world? And have you noticed the same things for Black authors in the publishing world? Wait, you write as well, don't you?
I do, yeah. And that's more for my own, maintaining my own sanity, you know. Okay. But yeah, and if anything, I will say that has enabled me to, when it comes to working with authors on revisions, to approach, and this is a little sidebar, but the ability to approach from a level of empathy that I don't think I would have if I didn't write, because I feel like a lot of times with agents, you can, and no shade to any agents at all. This is not trying to be dismissive of any agent's process, but it can be very easy to say, this is not working, fix it, and then put all that onus on the author. And I've found that in having a background in writing, it allows me to come from a lot more collaborative mindset. And so, hey, this isn't working. Let's brainstorm together how we might fix whatever's not clicking here. Instead of just being like, hey, fix it and get back to me. Because I feel like sometimes that can feel very disheartening to authors, of like, oh crap, I have to have all the answers. Like, no, you don't have to have all the answers. We can kind of brainstorm it together. And of course, it's your work, and so whatever you decide is what we're going to do. But having that creative sounding board, I found, can be really helpful. But anyway, in terms of struggles for Black agents and Black authors, that's a whole different panel. I think from us, okay, I can speak from the agent side. I think one of the biggest struggles is kind of that tokenism that I spoke about a little bit earlier, of especially when it comes to submissions, a lot of times my identity being used as the sole reason for reaching out to me. And so a lot of times I will have authors who will say, oh, I have this narrative. I am a non-Black author writing about a Black character, and I want to have a Black agent to make sure that I got it right. And I think that is its kind of own version of, oh, well, I can't be racist, I have a Black friend. And so just like the emotional labor that has to go into reading queries of just like, okay, no, I can't be your token agent here, especially when our relationship will a lot of times be contingent upon me being like saying like, hey, this is not working. And so like if you're already coming into the situation being like, oh, but I need you to kind of be my stopgap and make sure and kind of assure me that I'm being a good person, that already that makes our relationship it ultimately would be harmful to the author, I think. And at the end of the day, your agent should always be 100% in your corner and doing whatever they need to do to help you, not only with your book, but in your career in its entirety. And so when you start off a relationship in this weird kind of tokenist vibe, that makes that virtually impossible. I would say
also harmful to you.
Yes, and also harmful to the agent as well. That is true.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I would think on the pitching side, and when I say pitching, I mean submitting a client's projects to editors. I think one of the hardest things, and this is, I would say specifically when pitching a POC author to a white editor, and sometimes even more specifically, a Black author to a white editor, just the extra emotional labor that you have to put in that, quite frankly, white agents probably don't. When they are pitching a white author. And what I mean by that is a huge part of my job when I'm submitting a project is essentially making a case for your book to the editor. So yes, of course, like the writing has to be good. Yes, the story has to be tight, but I also have to, I have to also speak to them from a marketing standpoint. So I have to be like, okay, here's who the audience for this is going to be. Here's, what the comp titles for this are. And so when we say comps, we mean comparative or competitive titles. And so if you were to walk into a bookstore or Barnes and Noble, what books would be on either side of the shelf of yours? Those are your comps. So they're kind of like the cohort that your book exists within. And so we'll say comps as a means to pitch your book. And so also speaking from a marketing standpoint, and when you are pitching a Black author or a narrative that is inherently tied to the Black experience, I found that a lot of times I'm doing also extra legwork to convince the editor, no, you don't know who this audience is, but this book needs to be published. And sometimes that can be the fact that on top of trying to just sell your book in general, I'm now also trying to convince the editor that this story from this author matters, which they wouldn't put into question if it were a white author. And so a lot of times that can feel, it's necessary. And so I don't ever regret or begrudge having to do it. If anything, that's the only way the publishing industry is going to change, is if you I sit down and have those tough conversations of like, okay, yes, I know that you don't feel you a lot of times, but I don't know who the audience for this book is. That's okay. That's fine. I will tell you who the audience for this book is. We'll talk it out together. Don't worry. I'll help you get there. But it can be draining. But at the same time, that's the only way the industry is going to change.
That's a lot. Okay, you take on a lot there.
Yeah, like that could be its own panel. Yeah. And to answer your second question of what's the biggest struggle, I think for Black authors, and of course I can't speak to this kind of as strongly because I, at this moment, not a published Black author. But I will say, based on what I've seen, I think actually one of the most difficult things, and what's great is that you guys are already kind of preempting this, is finding community. So much of, I think, being a successful author isn't tied to having, the fancy awards or the grants or the fellowships. Those are nice, of course, the MFA, but really having that core community that is going to come out and support you in your work. That really is what I think puts authors over the edge, in terms of success when their book comes out, having that built-in community to hype them up. And also to make those connections as well. And so I would say finding community where that feels generative and nourishing. Because having a writer's group, if every time you submit your work to a writer's group, you feel like you're having, again, to defend that work tooth and nail, to be treated as valid, that's not necessarily a community. I mean, that's to say that there's not stuff to be gained out of writers groups in general, but just having someone saying like, I see what you're doing and I support it, that I think is invaluable.
What is the most recent book that came out and you're like, damn, I wish I represented that?
Oh my God, so many. Okay, let's see. The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. Oh my God. Oh my God, I wish. I just finished rereading that book. It's not speculative, but if you were to ask me what's a book, the answer to your question of what's a book you recently read, that you felt seen, that book, oh my goodness. And what's so funny is, so I grew up in Georgia and my mom was actually not like uber religious, but like church was an integral part of her life. And because I was a kid and I didn't pay any bills, it was an integral part of my life as well. And so we absolutely went to church every Sunday. You know, and me being the tourist that I am, I hated going. I was like, you can make me go, but I'm not going to pay attention. And so I would very purposely like space out during sermons. I would very purposely like not absorb anything. And she made me do that until I was 18. But then something must have stuck because I started reading The Secret Lives of Church Ladies and it felt immediately like I was like, I recognize this. Like of course I cannot quote scripture because I very purposely made sure that I couldn't. I regret that a little bit now, more for like writing reasons. But even so, again, just feeling so recognized and also recognizing the characters in that book. And so absolutely, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. I wish I represented that book.
That book made me feel seen, and I was just like,
yeah.
I'm not the target, but this is very real. I see sisters, cousins, aunties, and grannies.
Yeah, everywhere. Yep.
Yeah, about it. Yeah. So that kind of does it for me for questions. I wanted to open it up to the participants. So y'all, I want you to use the raise hand feature. That'll let me give you space in order of asking them. So raise your hands and yeah. All right, so sometimes Ola isn't up for talking, so I'm gonna just read her question. How do people get these deals where they get to publish 3 books at a time and have a film and TV deals attached? Sounds so epic.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I will say, so before I answer that directly, I will say I think publishing, it's important for authors to remember that publishing is a marathon, not a sprint. And it can be easy, even as an agent, I will forget that sometimes when you see all these deals being announced and oh my God, so-and-so, yeah, like got this production company on board for the film TV adaptation. But remembering that literally years and years and years and years and years of work go into not just the creation of the book, but also any ancillary subsidiary rights. And so that's like film, audio, translation, that gets attached to a book. And so usually what happens is, and of course, take this with a grain of salt. This is purely for a hypothetical situation. Of course, everybody's path to publishing is different. But usually what happens is an author puts out one book or places one book with a publisher. It does, it's their debut. It does moderately well. If it's usually with fantasy or specifically sci-fi and fantasy, there's going to be a trilogy or there's going to be a multi-book deal of some sort. It may not be with that first book. It may be that they put out a standalone novel, they put out 2 standalone novels, then they say, oh wait, actually I have a series in mind, I have a trilogy in mind. At that point, when you start to build up an audience, a publisher is more likely to want to take a gamble on you. And so they'll say, okay, sure, well, let's buy the next 3 books for this author. And note that with each book, how many years it takes for you guys to write it. You know, that's specific to each person. But then also you work on it with an agent, then you shop it to the publisher, then the publisher edits it, and then you have production where they're coming up with the comps, they're coming up with the sales pitch, they're coming up with the cover, they're coming up with the copy, which is that paragraph on the back. And so all that to say, there's so many machinations that are going on, where usually a book takes anywhere from the time that you get an agent, usually anywhere from 2 to 3 years before it's on an actual shelf. And so take that and multiply that by 3. And so you have 3 books. By then, you know, at that point, you know, it's 9 years, you've developed this following. Then a film agent's gonna say, oh, well, I see that this author has this track record. You know, they have these previous books, they have a fan base that they've created from putting out these books. But let's shop this around to a couple of production companies and see if they're interested. That in itself, I've literally been in situations where that takes 5 years. And so again, it's so much of a long haul. And so anywhere from 10 to, you know, 15, 20 years. But in that time, again, you are that all that time isn't for naught. You know, like you are still doing your work, you're still creating these fabulous stories, you're still creating a fan base. And I really do think at the end of the day, something like a film deal, that's like icing on the cake. That if anything, that shouldn't be the end goal. Because also film deal, and that's also another panel, film deals fall apart all the time. Really, your goal should be becoming the best writer possible. And I know that sounds so cheesy, but I really do think it's true, of writing your truth and finding people that rock with that. And then anything else is just icing on the cake.
And I'm in New Orleans, but I live in Los Angeles, and like the ways that film deals fall apart and come together, when you see people who like, yeah, they just got a X number book deal, and someone bought the movie rights at the same time. It's like, that's cool and everything, but that just means that things were working beforehand. There's no
Yes, behind the scenes, and usually for years. And so thank you, LP. That's a beautiful kind of encapsulation of what I was saying. Of anytime you see that, like that great announcement, like, yes, give that person their love, but also like, no, that was probably 5, 6, 7, 8 years in the making. It didn't just happen, and you'll get there too.
Nikita.
Hi, good day. So my question is, what are some warnings that you wish you could give to first-time authors, or like any pitfalls that you want them to avoid? I've heard horror stories, but not necessarily preventative measures, and I was wondering if you could talk about them.
Yeah, that's a great question. That is a fantastic question. I think first and foremost, do your research. And when I say do your research, I mean when you feel you are ready to start sending out your project for submission, really take the time to take care with who you're sending it to, right? This is your you've put your blood, sweat, and tears into this book. And so really doing your diligence of, okay, is this someone I can see building my career with? Not necessarily is this someone who can sell my book, is this someone with a fancy name, but is this someone I can see building my career with as a writer? And that may take a while. And so I always advise authors, and I get it, it's exciting. You're like, oh my God, I've workshopped this thing so many times, I've revised it, I just want other people to see it. But take a step back for a second, take a couple of weeks to really dig in, do your research, come up with that core list of, 5, 10, 15 agents that you're like, no, I really could see myself building a career with them. And so doing your research, again, finding that community, like you said, hearing horror stories, I think say a little asterisk over that, find your community, and glean what is helpful for you from that community. Because I do think sometimes it can become an echo chamber of horror stories. And it's like, oh my God, are all agents awful? No. There's some truly some of the nicest people I've met are agents. It makes sense. Like, we all love books. But also that those whisper networks can be very invaluable, of like, oh, well, I heard this person was dissatisfied from an agent because whatever reason, or I heard, that agency, it seems a little suspect. And there are kind of fake agents, schmagents that we call them, where the only reason that we call them that is because the way they work with their clients runs in direct counter to the guidelines established by the AALA, or the American Association of Literary Agents. So when you are submitting to somebody, no money should exchange hands. Your agent only makes money when you make money, when they sell your book. And so no one should be charging you a reader's fee or a submission fee you have to pay me to consider your project, or you have to pay me to get your project ready for submission. That person's trying to be exploitative. Also, industry standard in terms of what an agent makes from the sale of your book is 15%. It gets a little bit different when it's film. So when they sell the film rights for your book or the translation rights, but 15% is so any earnings. Say your book makes a certain amount of money in advance amount, your agent gets 15% of that, not 50, not 75, 15. And so do your research, tap into those whisper networks, but also trust your gut. And I know that also sounds cheesy, but I genuinely think in a conversation, you can tell when you're vibing with somebody. Of course, like things like email sometimes, especially with everybody working virtually, sometimes things don't come across. But when you're getting on the phone with these agents, should you get to that point in the conversation, really treat it as kind of like a mutual interview. So yes, like you want this person to offer you representation and sign you, but also like you're interviewing them to make sure that, again, that they're a good fit for you and that this is someone you want to build your career with. And if the answer is no, if you're talking with this person and you're like, I'm not really vibing, with either the vision that they have for this book or how I don't think we just work well together, listen to that voice, even if they are the only agent who is offering. And I know that sounds ludicrous, but I think no agent is better than the agent that is the wrong fit for you. Because I've seen scenarios where an agent and an author who weren't really vibing, they're like, oh, you're the only one, why not? Let's just do it. And then that always comes back in some way, not necessarily in a horrific way, but just more just like the relationship doesn't feel as seamless as it could. And so I would say no agent is better than an agent that feels like a bad fit. So those are kind of my three things: do your research, tap into those whisper networks, and then also trust your gut.
Thank you very much.
Let's see. Now, LP, am I calling on people? Oh wait, I think you muted.
I mute myself because I'm not talking, but it doesn't help. Sorry. Deanne, continue, please.
Yeah, so it kind of actually dovetails great off of Nikita's question. So I'm interning at an agency, so I'm kind of already on that side, but what are some questions that you would advise authors to ask to get some information from agents, especially newer agents who don't have the multi six-figure deals, etc.?
Yes, great question. I would say one question I definitely ask is, where do you envision submitting this book, or where do you envision, what publisher? So kind of like, what is your submission plan? I would always refrain from asking, okay, how long until we get a publisher, because that is so up in the air. That I've seen books sell in a week. I've seen books sell after 12 months. And so really, and everything in between, and sometimes even afterwards. And so that an agent may not have a firm sense on timeline, but they should have, in reading your material, if they reached out to set up a call with you, they should already be thinking about the editors who would be really receptive to your book, or what publishers would be a really good home for your book. Even if they don't have specific names, they should be able to be like, oh my God, well, this absolutely seems like an Orbit book, or this absolutely seems like something Harper Voyager would really enjoy, or even more, if they're really excited about it, thinking about, subsidiary rights of, and I absolutely could see this being a book to film adaptation. So ultimately, do they have a long-term kind of vision for what this book looks like? Because if so, that's great. That means that they've really already sat down, even before they've signed you, and tried to plot out, and even in the vaguest points of like kind of what the trajectory for this book will be. Another question you should ask is, how do you what is working at your agency look like, or how do you work with your fellow agents? Because it'll be helpful to you if that agent says, oh, well, yeah, our environment is super collaborative. I can pop over to any of my other agents and ask a question, because then you're getting to tap into the resources of 8 other agents outside of whoever represents you. And that can also be really helpful with younger agents. And so, of course, being a younger agent, that is always like a drum I will beat of yes, like sub younger agents, even if they don't have the extensive track record of someone who's been in the industry for 20 plus years. There are absolutely benefits that come with working with a younger agent, and we can get into those in a second. And it may be a little self-serving because again, as being a younger agent, but I genuinely think there are benefits to it. But just again, like, how do they work? Like, what is kind of like the work environment of their agency like? I think is the way to phrase that question. And then finally, like, how do you work with your clients? And so getting a sense of what the work dynamic will be between the two of you. And so like, hey, like, how do you best communicate with your clients? Are you an email person? Are you a texter? Do you like to hop on the phone? What are your hours? Like, do you have set hours? Some agents are like, don't email me after 6 p.m. I'm one of them, just establishing those work-life boundaries. There are other agents who are like, hey, you can just email me whenever and I'll get back to you whenever. And so getting a firm sense of just how they work, how hands-on are they with their clients? And that doesn't not being more hands-on doesn't necessarily mean better. It really, I think, depends on who you are. I'm sure there are some people who are like, you're breathing down my neck, I'll come back to you when I have something. And there are other people who are like, no, I would love to hop on the phone every week. Some people every day, that's a little too much for me. but so just really getting a sense of how they work. So I think those are the 3 questions that an author should ask. Let me see if I'm forgetting anything. Oh, also, and this is not a specific question, but more an attitude. I think you should feel free during your call to ask any like publishing centric questions, just like publishing 101 questions is always what I call them. And so don't feel that you have to come to that call prepared and have an intimate knowledge of the industry. That's literally what the agent is for. And so if you want to even ask like, hey, I actually don't know what an agent does. Like, what do you do? That's a fair question to ask in the call. Or what does submitting to what does that mean? How do you submit to an editor? They should also be that kind of pool of knowledge for you to give you that publishing 101, as I call it, advice.
Dope. There's a question from Adrian who asked, how much input does an agent put into contract negotiation? Really fight joint accounting, for example, or should an author just get a lawyer?
That's a great question too. You guys have fantastic questions. Agents have an extreme part in contract negotiations. I would say that if anything else, that's the reason you should have an agent. Just because I have clients who accepted an offer before they signed with me. And so they were approached by a publisher, not being unrepresented. And in doing so, agreed to parts of their contract that weren't industry standard, and how you don't know what you don't know, right? And so that's a key function that agents play in kind of advocating for your book, yes, on the editorial side, but also on the contract side, and making sure that the standards of the terms of your agreement are industry standard and are as favorable to you as the author as possible. And then also, quite frankly, not being afraid to be the bad guy. And so and again, excuse my language, if the publisher thinks I'm an asshole, I don't really care. so like, you don't have to worry about, and I get that that's a delicate line to walk as an author. You've just sold your book. You want to, start your relationship with your new editor, which is so exciting, on the right foot. It's very easy to be like, oh my God, okay, yes, let's just agree to everything. I don't want to, rock the boat. And me, I'm like, oh, I don't care, I'll rock the boat. and that's really what they're there for, to advocate for you. I would say you don't need a lawyer. Not because they don't have knowledge, but because publishing is such a niche industry that unless they are a lawyer with a publishing background, that's what I will say. Because a lot of times lawyers will ask, take this out. And it's like, no, we can't take that out. That's language specifically to, specific to HarperCollins or specific to Simon and Schuster. And if anything, it just creates, it's kind of like more cooks in the kitchen. That being said, if an author is adamant, like, no, I want a lawyer to look this over, it would just make me feel better. It would vary from agent to agent. I would be like, okay, that is your right as the author. We can have that in there, but no, it's gonna maybe slow down the process a little bit, because I feel like there's gonna be an extra level of the agent explaining to the lawyer what the language is. And so it will muddy things up a little bit. But again, if that's something that's super important to the author, that's fine. With, I'll say, publishing adjacent industries, I've seen scenarios where an agent will say, I don't feel equipped to go through this contract, we need a lawyer. And so, for example, with book to film adaptations, that is its own niche industry. And so that would be a scenario where like an entertainment lawyer would actually have insight that would be really, really, really helpful. But when it comes to books, that's a core part of an agent's job. And so I definitely think they have the expertise to go through a contract in a more kind of with a more nuanced understanding than a lawyer would.
Oh. Hey, Adrian, question number 2.
Yeah, I'm the person that asked the first lawyer question. Just as a follow-up question, I get a lot of ask as a lawyer. I'm a book publishing lawyer. A lot of my clients have a challenge of what do you do with an agent that takes a long time to respond to your first, like they'll say, yeah, let me see the manuscript, or yes, let me see whatever you're doing. And then it takes a long time for them to get back to the author. And I do a lot of hand-holding of, trying to guess what the silence means. But I'm always encouraging authors, go ahead and push at the agent and ask, am I in or am I out? Can you give me a timeline? What are your thoughts of the care and feeding of your agent once you get one?
Yeah, and just to make sure I understand, are you talking about when an agent has read like your query or your manuscript and is saying, hey, and then you were like, hey,
yes.
Okay, got it.
Yes.
Yeah, that is tricky. And tricky because I think one of the grandest ironies of being an agent is reading submissions is how you find your clients. It is also the thing you have the least amount of time to do. And so, especially maybe not so much with younger agents who are hungry, who are building their list, but definitely with agents who have, even five to 10 clients under their belt. As you take on more clients and their books start to come out, more and more of your job starts to focus from reading queries and reading submissions to managing those clients, which makes sense. So now, their book has come out. Okay, now we got to prep for the second book. We got to prepare that submission. Oh, wait, this film agent's interested in you. Okay, let's arrange that. And we got to start talking about the Spanish translation for the book. And then multiply that by how many other clients they have. A significant portion of your day now becomes managing the careers of the clients you already have. And unfortunately, that always gets prioritized over someone who is not yet your client. So that's usually the rationale for why agents take so slow. That being said, I can understand like how stressful it can be of like, hey, I submitted this to you. You said you wanted to see it. Where are we? And so I would say, coming from a place of empathy, but also accountability. It's the kind of the way to walk that line. And so absolutely feel free to follow up. I would say maybe after 3 months, maybe not. So following up every week is not going to be helpful, just because I know no agent reads that fast. But absolutely, if you haven't heard from them in 3 months, 6 months, feel free to circle back and say, hey, I just want to know where you're at with this. Any information you can give me would be helpful. And no agent will get upset about that. They may even say like, hey, so sorry, it's in my queue. They may give you like more detailed update of like, oh, I'm reading it, or I'm having my interns read it, and then they're going to pass it on to me. Sometimes you won't hear anything. It really just dependent on who the agent is, quite frankly. But ultimately, I guess to answer this question in the way that's most helpful to you, one, look at the queer guidelines. And so a lot of times they'll say, if you don't hear back from, if someone's requested your manuscript, you may hear back from us by X time. That is an aspirational number, of course. If that time period has passed, then feel free to follow up. If they don't have any specifications on like when they'll get back to you by, I would say 3 months is the kind of rule of thumb. And after that, maybe once every other month, until you hear something back. But again, kind of walk that line with empathy while also still holding the agent accountable.
I mute myself because I'm just trying to chill out the noise. That was fantastic. So that hits our hour. So I want to thank you for being here because obviously we really appreciate it. You brought in a wealth of expertise and knowledge and blown my mind because I thought I was pretty good on what I knew about publishing, and apparently there's still some more for me to learn. So that's good.
No, you're learning something new every day. Honestly, there, especially with agenting, so much of the job is coming across something in your day and being like, I don't know what this is, but I'll figure it out. That's the amount of times newer agents like me, even agents who have been in the game like 20 years, are like, I don't know what this is, but I guess we got to figure it out. And so all that to say, publishing is changing so much. There's always something new to learn, always.
That was very gracious of you. I think you're giving more credit than I deserve, and that's okay.
But yeah, no, this is fantastic. Thank you for having me. Oh no, that's right, LP, you said you would drop my manuscript wish list in the chat. And so please, if you feel like you got anything.
Let me drop it again.
Oh yeah. If you guys see anything that it feels like it's something you're working on, by all means, feel free to query me. Also, I'm on Twitter way more than I should be, and so a lot of times I'll put kind of ad hoc manuscript wish list ideas out into the Twitter universe that way, and so that's how you can often stay up to date on what I'm looking for.
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, look, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you. You've made the night, you made the day.
Made the day. Whatever time it is where you are.
Yeah, because some of us are in Africa, some of us are in the continental US, some of us are in South America. So you made a thing, and it's happened, and it's really good.
Awesome. It's fantastic what you guys are doing. Truly, like this is so cool.
Thank you. We just want to bridge the gap and make sure that people know that we need their stories and that we're here to support them in making the stories and getting the stories into the world.
Absolutely.
1 and 2.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna stop recording.